No, I didn't. Yes, I did.
Short answer, yes. The name Nanotyrannus was proposed largely because early researchers lacked a clear growth series of juvenile Tyrannosaurus rex fossils and assumed the small, lightly built skulls they found represented a separate species rather than young T. rex. Here is the fuller explanation. When the first small Tyrannosaur skulls were discovered in the 1940s and 1980s, paleontologists did not yet have many examples of clearly juvenile T. rex specimens. The best-known adult fossils, like Sioux, were huge, thick-boned animals. The smaller skulls looked different in several ways. They were slimmer, had more teeth, and had different proportions. Because of those differences, some researchers concluded they were not immature T. rex at all, but a distinct genus. In 1988, Robert Bakker and colleagues formally named one of these specimens Nanotyrannus lancensis,
Yes.
meaning dwarf tyrant. At that time, the fossil record of tyrannosaurs was very incomplete. Scientists had many adult specimens and a few fragmentary pieces, but almost no well-preserved individuals that clearly represented teenagers or younger growth stages. Without a developmental series to compare, it seemed reasonable to interpret the small skulls as a separate animal. Over the last 3 decades, that situation changed. New discoveries filled in the gaps. Specimens like Jane and Petey, along with several others, showed a clear pattern of growth from small, slender, toothier tyrannosaurs into massive, robust adult T. rex forms. Bone histology studies, which examine microscopic growth rings in the bones, demonstrated that these so-called Nanotyrannus individuals were still rapidly growing juveniles, not fully grown dwarfs. Modern analysis indicates that the differences once used to define Nanotyrannus match what we would expect in a young tyrannosaur. Juvenile T. rex had longer legs, narrower skulls, and more teeth. As they matured, their skulls thickened, tooth counts decreased, and the overall proportions changed. What looked like a separate species was actually a growth stage. Today, most paleontologists consider Nanotyrannus to be invalid and view the fossils assigned to it as juvenile Tyrannosaurus rex. The name arose primarily because researchers lacked enough juvenile fossils to recognize normal developmental variation. So your premise is correct. The idea of Nanotyrannus was born out of limited data, and as more fossils of young T. rex were found, the need for a separate genus largely disappeared.
All right. Let's go ahead and